Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for coming to this Society of Labour Lawyers event about rent controls. We're talking this evening about rent controls, which were abolished in the 1980s in this country after about 70 years of working fairly successfully. And in very recent years, they've begun to feature quite prominently in discussion with Labour mayors of most of the major cities calling for powers to keep rents under control in some form or another. And it's probably a sign of just how bad the housing crisis has got that we're now talking seriously about bringing them back after the subject of rent controls has been dead in the water for so many years. And we've got an excellent panel this evening. First to speak, we'll have Sem Moema, who is a London Assembly member and has roles on its housing committee, as well as being chair of the Labour Housing Group. Perhaps most importantly for our purposes, she's the Mayoral Advisor for the private rented sector and affordability. So Sem's positioned at this sort of flashpoint between the London Mayor's ambition to gain rent controls of some form and central government's refusal to do anything about it. Next to speak, we'll have Caitlin Wilkinson, who is currently Policy and Public Affairs Manager at Generation Rent. And Generation Rent, I think it's fair to say, were one of the early adopters of calling for some form of rent control. And Caitlin's been at the forefront of campaigning for renters' rights for some time, so is well placed to talk to us about it. And finally, we'll have David Watkinson, formerly a specialist housing barrister, now retired. And David began his practice in the 1970s, so we have the advantage of his experience of actually existing rent controls, a world in which rent officers and fair rents and such like existed, rather than being a legislative ambition. So we're looking forward to hearing from them, particularly when we see the news this week that the Mayor is worried about the possibility of rents rising by more than £300 over the next few years. And can I start, please, by passing over to Sem?
Yeah, thank you so much. And it's really nice to speak to all of you. As Nick has said, I'm recently elected at the Assembly and I lead on the Housing Committee for the Labour Group. And within my role in Hackney, I'm the Mayoral Advisor for the private rented sector and housing affordability. So we have in the past worked with Generation Rent, and we've done work in the last year or so with London Renters Union and Telco Citizens. And I'm here really just to also, as well as talk about some of the work and the issues that we face, to really learn from SLL about what is possible and, you know, to pick up those relationships as well and see what more we can do. But in terms of our ambitions, and I should also say, you know, that work that the Mayor is doing and that he's laid out in his manifesto, I think it's hugely ambitious. And those few lines in the manifesto were just welcome relief. And I'm really pleased to be here with people who think, oh, it's possible to do both more social and affordable housing, but also to stabilise the millions of people across the capital who live in the private rented sector with virtually no protections. So in terms of a Hackney case study, as Nick said, it's not just a London problem, it's across major conurbations across England. But we have in Hackney 34,000 households in the private rented sector. It's about a third of the borough, and it's growing faster than the owner-occupier sector, and for slightly different reasons, growing faster than the social rented sector. One of the things that we have experienced through lockdown is that the moratorium on evictions was really, really welcome, because it meant that people were able to think about staying put, and people were able to have, if you like, a bit of a breather from being concerned about being evicted at the end of their fixed terms. But I guess anecdotally, we have heard from colleagues in housing needs who deal with housing benefits claims, universal credit claims, that there's been a marked increase in the number of people who are private tenants who have been applying for universal credit or support from the council. And that's a really good thing, because people have begun, I think, maybe through necessity, to overcome that concern about applying for council support or state support. But it does mean that, you know, if the government does withdraw universal credit uplift, but also now that the moratorium has ended, Sadiq's concerns about rents going up by hundreds of pounds and it means that hundreds, possibly thousands of tenants in our borough alone are at risk of eviction and being statutorily homeless. And we know that that is the number, that the pressures that causes on the housing waiting list. And so we've tried to look at a few ways to kind of, if you like, intervene or show best practice and demonstrate what is possible within the law as it stands now in the borough. So within that, my portfolio, I also work with our housing association partners. And, I was really pleased the year before, everything feels like last year, but it's the year before, around 300 homes owned by registered providers here in Hackney that are rented privately. That particular RP agreed to effectively rent stabilise them and offer kind of controlled rent increases year on year. And that was off the back of a lot of casework that had been kind of brought forward to me and to senior officers. And that was a really welcome intervention, hopefully on the part of those tenants, but also on the part of us in terms of kind of not receiving that casework, but also for those people who no longer were worried about kind of ever escalating increases in their rents. And obviously there's always lots more months left at the end of lots of people's pay packets. One of the other things that we've tried to demonstrate as well is a version of Sadiq Khan's London Living Rent programme. So the London Living Rents, which are benchmarked and set by City Hall every year, they are what is an equivalent rent, a median rent, so a third of local income set by ward across the whole of the capital. It's a really useful tool, I think, if people here were looking at how they might set and meaningfully kind of do some worked examples of how a rent control would work and how that could be scaled up. So here in Hackney, and I know the other two boroughs that I represent, Islington and Waltham Forest, have their own versions of local living rents, and those are homes which are rented at an affordable level to people in the private rented sector who would not qualify for social housing, but also priced out of home ownership. So we have a target of around 500, and it's fair to say it's been quite difficult, but not impossible. We're looking very much at people who are kind of low to middle income households, somebody who might be, for example, working at the local Homerton Hospital in kind of a middle income role there, whether they're a nurse, porter, and so on. And one of the things which was really important to us when we were setting that rent policy was to look at income levels as opposed to particular roles. There's a slight difference from the Mayor of London's position, which is also, in addition, offered key worker accommodation. And part of that was actually conversations that happened through the pandemic at the beginning, that somebody like an estate cleaner, for example, or an apprentice who works for the council should be able to rent in our borough. So it was kind of based on incomes in that particular way. And just by way of example, something which is, the average rent is slightly out of date numbers, but an average rent for a 2-bedroom flat in Hackney would be about £1,800. And an equivalent Hackney living rent property would be between £700 and £900, depending on where it was in the borough. So that makes a massive, massive difference. And I suppose the politics of it all is that we as a Labour administration, and now me as a Labour Assembly member sitting within the Labour group, we have a commitment to the people of the whole capital, whether they're in outer London, inner London, and whether they're renting flats, house shares, and so on. For me personally, it's really, really important that we think about what are the impacts of having that lack of stability on the household, whether it's a family with young children, or whether it's maybe an old household with older people who are fast approaching a fixed income. And for us in Hackney, that was actually a very important criteria, which it sometimes does feel is left out of the debate about rent controls and their impact on the whole breadth of Londoners. So I just think that there is a massive opportunity there to look at how we can make sure that people are able to stay put, if you like, whilst the mayor and boroughs restart council house building and we're able to replenish the stock that's been lost over decades. So I did do a little bit of research, you'll be pleased to know, before I came to see you all. And one of the things that Sadiq Khan has proposed is a mayor's commission with the private rented sector. And, you know, having kind of spoken to a few people, it would be some along the lines of the Living Wage Commission that took place a few years back to put in place a living wage and a London living wage. And that's had massive impacts. And I suppose the key thing to take away is that we're not looking for an off-the-shelf response to rent issues in the capital. We're looking for something that works for landlords and also tenants, but primarily, you know, tenants are absolutely fall square at the heart of that, and something that doesn't constrain supply. So I know that David and Caitlin, you have much more in-depth knowledge about particular models in other countries and cities. And, you know, if the best of those examples could apply to certain aspects of the private rented sector here in Hackney, here in London, stop saying that, then it would be really, really welcome, but definitely something which is bespoke and meets our particular needs. And yeah, I think that point again, that any rent control that works in London needs to be just as much about affordability and stability in equal measure, and looking at things as the model currently stands, of the inequalities between tenancies and those struggles that people have whilst they're, if you like, trapped within an assured short hold tenancy, of not being able to move, but also being concerned about giving up that tenancy and where they will go next. And, you know, I think ultimately there are some financial benefits as well to having this kind of control to the public purse. Housing benefits, for example, could in theory be put under control. And also some of that money, I would like to think, would be put to better use, developing new council housing as opposed to putting it into the pockets of private landlords. And I think one of the things that has come out of the pandemic is that landlords are, there was a bit of a break given to landlords in terms of their repayments to their lenders. And there is a risk, I suppose, that we kind of vilify those landlords. Most people are good people who have invested in a single property, one or two properties, because the pension situation is just absolutely appalling and atrocious. And I'm sure you guys will come back to that particular topic as an SLL at a future date, but it's something which needs to benefit both sides of that coin, I suppose. Yeah, I just think that if there are ideas and suggestions about how that particular commission could work and bring forward ideas, then it'd be really, really welcome. And in terms of the benefits to the people that I represent here in Hackney, I think a control would be life-changing for tens of thousands of people. One of the first things I did when I took up my post in 2016 was to meet a group of young people who were working with their school. It was a citizenship project around rents and poor conditions, and the stories were both compelling and heartbreaking, that people who were 13, 14, 15 were living in particular situations which meant that they were finding it difficult to study. Obviously, the impact that they were able to just talk about very matter-of-factly on their attainment and their ability to kind of progress, and they're doing really, really well. And that has been compounded by the pandemic. You know, people have been forced to stay at home in homes which are potentially not fit, and paying through the nose for them. So I just hope that this session looks at or asks the questions of how that can be fixed. So I'll probably stop there and hope that there's other questions, but thank you very much.
Sam, that's great. Thanks very much. And it's really encouraging to hear how the policy's been gestating and evolving during the Mayor's term of office. Can I pass on to Caitlin, please?
Thanks, Nick. Thanks, Sam. Thanks for having me. I'm Caitlin from Generation Rent, the national campaign group for private renters. I am going to speak a little bit about Sadiq Khan's commitment to introduce rent controls and what we at Generation Rent thought about it, and our research on what form that system of rent control could take. I've actually prepared a couple of slides, to no doubt to some of your horror. I'll just get them up now. Sorry, bear with me. I think awkward elevator music should play at this point while I try and work out what's going on. Cool. So in short, Generation Rent obviously really welcomed the commitment from the mayor that he would campaign to introduce rent controls in London. I mean, I don't think I need to labour the point that rents are too expensive. So the most recent English housing survey that came out last week said that Londoners were spending on average over 40% of their income on rent, when most affordability measures class anything over 30% as unaffordable. I think it's really, really positive, as Nick said, that there are mayors now, and it's not just Sadiq Khan, that is making the point that rents need to come down and that there need to be some serious measures in place to tackle the affordability crisis in the private rented sector. Obviously, the mayor pledged to introduce rent controls and set up a London private rent commission, which would set rents and reduce them. But other than that, there isn't a huge amount of detail so far in how a system would work in London. And I'm also aware that when debating rent controls or talking about rent controls, I think we're all guilty of using that term to actually describe a really wide set of policy interventions, everything from caps on existing rents to much wider sort of setting of rent. So earlier this year, between February and March, Generation Rent, we basically set out to find out what rent tenants in London wanted from a system of rent control, and made a few recommendations, which I just thought I'd share with the audience today. I don't know how to do these slides. So we used our renters panel, which is a group of tenants in London. Basically, we asked our renters panel what they thought of various models of rent control that are in use across Europe. We tested the popularity of various models of rent control, and we've stopped short. I've stopped short of making an assessment of, of modelling or making a precise assessment of the viability of each of these models in London. But we'd really, as a small campaign group, welcome further work in this area and are looking to do further work on this ourselves. But our aim was to define what an effective system of rent control meant to tenants. And so our group of renters panel, we had 96 private renters respond to this. All of them are tenants in London at the minute, and most of them have first-hand experience of the affordability crisis facing Londoners. So of everyone who responded, almost half reported paying more than 50% of their income on rent, and another 39% reported spending between 30 and 50%. Two-thirds said that they considered their home as unaffordable, and only 1 in 10 people reported spending less than a third of their income on rent, which is basically what we'd be aiming for, or what most measures of affordability say is sustainable. And there's also extensive polling out there that says that renters, and indeed people of all tenures, like rent control. So the aim of this exercise was not to produce another sort of piece of evidence saying that rent controls are popular. I think we know that, but to really look at to collect some qualitative evidence on what people thought about different models of rent control that exist in Europe at the moment. So the first model that we asked people about is rent caps, where a board sets the maximum level of rent can charge. We used the model in operation in Berlin, that since we actually conducted this research has, I think, been ruled unconstitutional and is undergoing a judicial review, but which is a shame. But at the time of conducting this was in operation in Berlin. The second model that we looked at was the rent stabilisation and rent freezes on existing tenancies, which a form of this exists in Scotland at the moment, at least in theory. The third model that we asked people about was a points-based model, where essentially landlords are able to set the rent that they can charge based on the quality and location of the property, and a certain allocation of points, which sets the rent, and which is in operation in some areas of the Netherlands. And finally, the running costs model, which calculates how much it actually costs a landlord to let out a property, puts a small profit on top of that, and calculates the rent that way, which is in operation in some areas of Denmark. So I'm just going to run through our overall recommendations that were gleaned from people's responses as a whole, and then spend a little bit of time going through each model in turn, not in a huge amount of detail. Overall, from research, we basically have 4 findings. The first one is that our renters, as Sem said, that rent controls are essential both to ensure that tenants have basic security and are protected from a rent rise that might force them into an unwanted move. So our panellists all identified the fact that restrictions on rents rising is essential to make sure that people know that they're going to be able to afford their housing in years to come, and that they won't be forced to move from the areas that they currently live. We did find from the research that further measures to actively reduce rents are necessarily, at least this is how our panel felt in London, to ensure that housing is affordable, and that simply capping rent increases on existing tenancies won't go far enough. One thing that came out when looking at all across all 4 models is that clear links to the quality of accommodation should be considered as well. Lots of people said that they felt that this should be taken into account, and felt that this might incentivise landlords to still make repairs and ensure that the quality of homes produced are actually produced. Landlords don't produce housing. Quality of homes offered are actually decent as well. And our panel really liked systems that included tough penalties for landlords, including rent repayment orders or similar, who fail to follow the new regulations. So we recommend that in a new system, if it were introduced in London, that should be taken into account as well. Yeah, the first model that we asked people to look at is the Berlin, where the rents are capped at maximum amount for 5 years based on the location of a flat, of a property, and the quality as well. This was the most popular option amongst our attendees, who all spoke very highly of this model. Yeah, so just in detail, in February 2020, Berlin introduced rent caps, which set the maximum rent that a landlord can charge, and landlords are forbidden from increasing the rent on existing tenants for 5 years from then. I'm aware that this may change now, but I think it's still interesting to see what renters thought about it. And then landlords who ignore this cap could face fines of up to 500,000 euros. So this was actually the most popular of all 4 with respondents. 84 out of the 96 said that they would support something similar in London. I think there was a feeling by our panel that having a cap just set is very clear and simple, and would just make things a lot fairer for renters. The fact that it was based on quality, our panelists thought was positive, because it meant that at least the rent was more directly correlated to size or quality. But interestingly, some people did feel that a cap based on a location of a property might still result in some unaffordable properties being let out, especially in, there's an example on the slide of Tower Hamlets, but I think it's fair for lots of inner London boroughs where they're incredibly popular, but there's still, that still might mean that there are people that are priced out of desirable areas. And our panelists, multiple people responded saying that the fact that the cap was not set to change for 5 years just gave them the basic security that they'd be able to stay in their homes. And there were some concerns about how this would be enforced, and like whether it would encourage a sort of black market, and how actually 500,000 euro fines would be administered. But broadly, this was a model that our panelists were very, very positive about. I'm going to go on to the second one, which is rent pressure zones, which exist in Scotland, at least theoretically. So in Scotland, local authorities can apply to have their area designated as a rent pressure zone, which allows them to set restrictions on how often rents can rise within tenancies. To my knowledge, there are currently no rent pressure zones in operation, as they do. Once a council makes an application, the government don't have to grant it. So we ask people about the theory of it rather than the practice, and in practice these don't exist. Rent pressure zones, which basically where rent pressure zones were the least popular of all of our options. Our panelists felt that this would be a good first step and better than nothing, but made the point that if you just merely capping rent increases doesn't address the affordability pressures on the open market and doesn't address the fact that rents are already too high. I think that reflects the fact that the respondents in London were already spending upwards of 30 to 40% of their income on rent. So while capping in increases is essential to, as a stability measure, it's not alone going to make housing affordable in London. And multiple respondents also said that this put too much onus on the tenant, as in this system, it's the tenant's responsibility to challenge a rent increase in a rent pressure zone via a tribunal, which many people felt that they would not feel comfortable or able to do. So this one was, yeah, our least popular. I think people felt that it wasn't sufficient. I will go on to speak about Denmark now. So this model exists in some areas of Denmark, a running cost model, where rent is calculated on the cost of running and maintaining a property. It lets the landlord gather all the costs they have of operating and maintaining a home and adds a 7% rate of return on investment on top, which is not immediately clear how this works, you know, in London, there's for the proportion of landlords who don't have a mortgage, so their running cost would be, you would expect to be extremely low. And in the UK, I mean, 2/3 of landlords don't have a mortgage. So it's, yeah, there are sort of issues with this model. But we asked our panelists what they thought about it. And they liked that this was a clear set of criteria, and I liked the person saying, you know, it's realistic and it has something concrete and not just pulling figures out of thin air. And interestingly, in Denmark, to challenge some landlord that set the rent wrong incorrectly, tenants can take their case to a rent control board, which, if it rules in favour of the tenant, awards rent refunds of 36 months. Over 10, so over 10 of our panelists specifically mentioned that the rent control board was something that they really thought positively of and thought might work in London. I think harsh penalties of repayment orders of 36 months, our panelists felt like would be enough of a penalty to deter landlords from not sticking to the new rules. And someone pointed out that that's 3 times as much as rent repayment orders, which normally pay up to 12 months rent in the UK. So yeah, that was kind of the comments that came through on the Danish model. And our last one that we tested was in Holland, where a points-based system means that landlords are able to the maximum rent is calculated based on the quality of housing, and the more points a property gets, the higher the maximum rent can be. And then some cities go further than that, and so in The Hague, for example, houses worth fewer points in the system are limited to workers who are on medium and lower salaries. So this one was the second most popular after Berlin's rent caps. And basically our panel felt that it just sounded like a cheap and fair way of doing things. That the scheme in The Hague may be of that, the scheme in operation in The Hague may be of value to cities like London, where there's lots of essential workers. Some people did feel that, you know, does a points-based system just mean that landlords will be able to let out low quality properties for low rents and high quality properties for high rents? Like, what does this mean for people on lower incomes who need decent affordable housing, not just affordable housing? So that's something that would have to be looked at. But overall, our panel of renters felt very positively about this one. And yeah, so I just, in summary, we've been recommending, you know, the Mayor continues to campaign to demand powers from the government to actively reduce rents. I think it is important to start with freezing rents within tenancies. The government's upcoming Renters Reform Bill and the upcoming White Paper provides a really key opportunity to legislate for a system that doesn't allow rent increases above wages once the abolition of Section 21 no-fault evictions has been brought through. I think, yeah, what came through loud and clear from our panelists that when we're talking about rent controls, we have to be talking about more than just stopping rent increases and actively bringing things down to affordable levels. And I've just said affordable a lot, but affordable based on people's incomes, which as Affordable Housing Commission and the UN Commissioner and many other affordability measures do say, as a third of local incomes. I think that linking rents to the quality of home, if there's a way of doing this that can encourage landlords to make repairs, is a really good thing to consider in any model of rent control for London. And enforcement measures introduced, including rent repayment orders, or if possible, tougher penalties, are essential when, well, to be honest, when introducing any kind of legislative change in the PRS. But I think when it comes to rent controls, tough enforcement measures overseen by a board to do this are key to success. So that's, I'll wrap up there. That is what we, that's basically how we think that a system could work in London. I know that there's much more, I know that there's much more work that needs to be done on looking at, these are very top line recommendations, and it's something that Generation Rent will be looking at further, and will be hopefully very keen to work with anyone who is conducting research in this area, and I hope that there's some questions, that has prompted some questions from the audience, and identifies, at least it just like identifies areas for further work on this. But yeah, I'm going to wrap up there and hand over to David, if that's okay. We'll let Nick do it because he's
brilliant. Thanks, Caitlin. It's obvious that you've been doing loads of really intelligent work on this, so we've got a really good basis to sort of get up and go as and when we can. David, can I pass over to you? You'll have to unmute yourself first. Let me unmute you. There we go.
Hey, thank you very much, Nick. Okay, yes, that is my first point. Rent control is not new in the United Kingdom. From 1915 to 1988, with a gap at the end of the 1950s, there was a system of rent control in the private rented sector UK-wide. Over the years, its scope extended from unfurnished to furnished tenancies, with some exceptions. By legislation, the majority of tenancies became protected. That is, they had security of tenure and were subject to rent control. And it came about because of mass working class action during World War I. The story is taken up in Glasgow, which was vital for the production of munitions and for shipbuilding. Landlords took advantage of the war to increase rents. Before long, the wives of the workers organized and drove the landlords, agents and bailiffs off the streets. So the landlords sued the tenants for the rent, reckoning that they would obtain orders which they could enforce against the men's employers. But on the day of the court hearing, a mighty army of housewives, factory workers and dockers besieged the sheriff's court where the claims were to be held. The story ends thus. It was obvious to the sheriff that the situation was too desperate to play with. He telephoned to London and got put through to the Minister of Munitions, Mr. David Lloyd George, of whom you may have heard. The workers have left the factories, he said, after explaining the character of the case. They are threatening to pull down Glasgow. What am I to do? Stop the case, he was told. A Rent Restriction Act will be introduced immediately. So I've extracted that from this book, Revolt on the Clyde by William Gallagher. And Gallagher was a docker and activist in Glasgow, and he became a communist member of parliament. In its final legislative form, the Rent Restriction Acts became the Rent Act 1977. So how did that work? The system of rent control consisted of two tiers of rent determination. First of all, there was an application by the landlord or the tenant, initially to a rent officer who was appointed by the local authority. And if the rent officer's decision was appealed, a rent assessment committee, RAC, which was a tribunal consisting of a legal chair, an expert, usually a surveyor or an environmental health specialist, and a lay member determined the appeal. Both applied the same criteria set out in the Rent Act in determining the rent. They were to have regard to all the circumstances other than personal circumstances, and in particular to the age, character, locality and state of repair of the dwelling house and the quantity, quality and condition of the furniture, if provided. A statutory formula provided that any value attributed to scarcity of dwellings in the relevant locality was to be disregarded. There were other disregards, for example, improvements carried out by the tenant. The rent was registered by the rent officer, and for 2 years, no further application could be made. Decisions of the rent officer or the RAC could be challenged by way of the court proceeding now known as judicial review. And how did it come to an end, this system of rent control? As a result of the Housing Act 1988. We have reached the Thatcher years and the bonfire of controls on the private sector that came with them. The Housing Act 1988 provided that no more new Rent Act tenancies could be created after that act came into force. The same act introduced the assured tenancy and the assured short hold tenancy regimes. The assured short hold tenancy, as we know it today, was the result of the Housing Act 1996, but it began its form in 1988. Curiously, the assured tenancy was similar to the Rent Act tenancy, but a crucial difference was the rent control system. Assured tenancies, with assured tenancies, the rent was to be determined essentially as a market rent, that which might reasonably be expected to be let in the open market by a willing landlord under an assured tenancy. There are also disregards, similar to those under the Rent Act, for example, tenants' improvements. Application was to be made direct to the first tier tribunal, which replaced the RAC in 2013. And the life of a registered rent is 1 year after service of the notice of increase. The statute assumes that the result of this procedure will be an increase. Moreover, so far as the assured short hold tenancy was concerned, the rent control system was even less effective. If the landlord proposed a rent increase and the tenant refused, eviction or threat of eviction would follow. So once the assured short hold tenancy became the dominant form of tenure in the private rented sector, as it now is, the rent control system, such as it is, ceased to be effective. Others, in particular Caitlin just now, has spoken of recent rent control proposals, both here and in the UK, and Sam referred to other initiatives that have been taken at the beginning. I'm going to end with a proposal, but before I do, I would like to deal with the objections that those opposed to rent control would and do make. So those form, I think, into roughly 3 objections and 3 answers. It's often claimed that the regulation of the private rented sector would lead to landlords selling up, restricting supply and driving up costs. However, researchers at the Bank of England have argued that the disappearing landlord's principle would not have any meaningful effect on supply of homes. As an argument, it simply does not work in economic terms. But even if they are wrong, it seems to me that the answers to this objection are: 1, it didn't happen during periods of rent control. Throughout the 70-year period of rent control, a significant amount of properties continue to be available for rent. Indeed, in my experience, certain landlords, such as the freshwater metropolitan groups of companies, became adept in using the rent control mechanism by applying every 2 years to re-register, appealing to the RAC from the rent officer, and backing their applications with expert surveyor evidence rarely available to tenants, resulting in increased rents. There are also many attempts to avoid or evade rent control altogether by exploiting the exceptions to control as holiday lets, lettings to companies, or contending there was no letting but a license. Of course, we don't approve of such methods, but they indicate a commitment to renting. Secondly, where rent control has been introduced in other jurisdictions, that has not led to properties becoming available for rent. Examples are New York, Berlin, the Republic of Ireland, and so on. And thirdly, perhaps the strongest case for the flight theory is the growth of private rented sector lettings since the effective repeal of Rent Act control by the Housing Act 1988. Since then, the proportion of dwellings privately let has risen from approximately 8% of the total number of dwellings to, including owner-occupied dwellings, to approximately 20%. However, it is unlikely that the removal of rent control by itself caused that increase. During the same period, demand rose for private renting as a result in the decline in quantity and availability of local authority public housing, and of the decline in accessibility of housing for owner occupation, as those prices for housing for owner occupation rose dramatically. Moreover, the lifting of rent control by the 1957 Rent Act, before restoration in 1965, did not lead to any increase in property available for rent. Indeed, it actually fell as landlords took the opportunity to sell. So I come to my proposal for rent control, or rent assessment, or rent review, whichever term you might like to adopt. Essentially, it is similar to the Rent Act system, and it assumes repeal of the assured short hold tenancy provisions of Section 21 of the Housing Act 1988 as amended by 1996. It replaces the Housing Act 1988 market rent control model with a locally based expert tribunal, which could be part of the residential property tribunal. The landlord or the tenant would have the right to refer rent to it for assessment. And the tribunal would take into account all relevant factors as age, condition and state of repair, locality and the facilities provided, including furniture, if any, and the effect of any scarcity of dwellings in the area is to be disregarded. The last is crucial. Unless the factor of scarcity, which leads to higher rents, is removed, we are back to market rents. Also, rents determined by the tribunal for similar properties could be considered, so there would have to be a register of such rents. Rents will be fixed for a period of time, well, for example, 2 years. As to enforcement, if a landlord charged in excess of the registered rent, the tenant could recover the amount paid in excess from the landlord. In addition, it would be an offence to charge rents higher than that fixed. And I propose that local authorities would have the power to refer the rents of private dwellings to the tribunal for consideration. This proposal, by the way, is not dissimilar from what was put forward in the Fair Rent Scotland bill, which was supported by the Scottish Labour Party in the recent May elections. So I would suggest that this is a system which is independent, specific, has clear criteria, is enforceable, and, in my opinion, fair to both landlord and tenant. I leave it there.
Thank you, David, and let's hope we get something of that nature before history repeats itself and we get 1915 struggles all over again. We've time for questions. Some have been sent in to me, and the first one is this, that Caitlin made a really important point about distinguishing between laws that stop the rent from going up and laws that actively drive rents down. And technically, both of them are a form of rent control, but they do very different things. Does the panel think it's useful to draw out that distinction and only use rent control to describe the more sort of ambitious rent lowering mechanisms? Or is it more useful sort of tactically and politically to include rent stabilisation as a form of rent control, perhaps as a way to make the whole thing seem less scary? And I'm particularly interested in what Sem and Caitlin think about this, given your campaigning and political roles. Can I come to Caitlin first?
Yeah, it's a good question, one we've thought a lot about. I personally think that the best strategy is to separate in tenancy rent restrictions from rent controls, because their function is very different. Their function is a security measure as opposed to an affordability measure. And I think the term rent controls is politically very divisive. When speaking to certain Conservative, either members of Parliament or people interested in housing, the term itself provokes a very strong and often negative response. And I think often quite detached from the mechanism that we're speaking about. So I think the words are important here, and I think that if you're talking about restriction, I think what I would recommend is, when speaking about restrictions on rent rises within tenancies, speak about restricting rent rises, speak about stopping retaliatory rent rises, use a different terminology, because that mechanism in itself has very little to do with what David's just set out, or the rent caps in use in Berlin. And it shouldn't be the way it is, that it's politicised in this way, but that is the environment in which we're operating in. So yeah, I think pick your audiences when using rent controls as a phrase.
Thanks. Sem, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think I definitely agree with Caitlin that words matter. And I guess for Hackney, but also the other two boroughs, but I think London boroughs as a whole, and it has to be said of all political colours, the issue of affordability is the most acute issue. And there is a growing issue, which has been exacerbated by COVID, with more people not having contracts or being out of work, of increases within tenancies. That's why people leave their tenancies before they get to a point of being evicted. So I think for me personally, with my Mayoral Advisor hat on, I definitely would want to focus on that, because that is the thing that will mean that people will be able to think beyond more than 12 months and think about being able to stay where they are. And people being able to stay where they are is so important to jobs, to family. Don't need to kind of rehash that, but even for us here in this audience, for things like civic life, you put down roots and you get involved in your community. And I come back to that point about people, whether they're either raising a family or whether they are approaching a fixed income, so maybe approaching retirement age or at retirement age, that those increases within the tenancy are, I think, the most acute issue to fix. I think there is a wider issue and a wider campaign issue around driving those rents down. I think you would more likely have consensus and be able to, if you like, pick off Conservative peers and MPs with the first approach, because that is the thing that is driving homelessness. And I think if London can get that under control, if cities across the country can get that under control, then there'll be some stability and level of normality, and obviously hopefully positive knock-on impacts for other kind of policy areas and the way that people live.
Thanks. Can I just follow up on that? Because I think what you're saying is it's acutely important that we go for the first approach and tackle affordability and spiralling rents. Do you think it's actively unhelpful to describe that as a form of rent control?
Well, I don't think we should shy away from the fact that it is. It's a tool within it. I think, though, the conversations around rent control can end up being quite technical. So I don't pretend to be somebody who has a very deep, in-depth knowledge of rent control. But I am somebody who, in terms of representing residents and shaping policy, have an understanding of looking at what might be the positive impact on the community that I represent. And I think we can tie ourselves in knots about the pluses and minuses of both. I think the ultimate outcome that we want is that people are able to, budget for their homes, understand that if they're in a place which is a third of local income, they're going to be able to pay the rent for the next 5-10 years while they raise their kids.
Great, thanks. The next question picks up on something David was talking about, and it's about the objections we often come across to rent control. And it's that we hear horror stories about restricted supply and shadow markets and things of that nature. Have the panel ever heard a horror story that's actually worse than the housing crisis we have now, or can rent controls only be an improvement? So I guess the question is, how seriously should we take these objections? And can I come to David first, please?
Thank you, Nick. I know the kind of horror stories that do get put round, that rent control can mean financial ruin for the landlord who's covered by them. I have to say I never came across one in the course of my practice, although I did say that it was no longer possible to create Rent Act protected tenancies after 1988. That didn't mean that they suddenly ceased to exist. In fact, right up to the very time when I retired, which is now about 7 or 8 years ago, I was still getting Rent Act cases coming through to my desk. It's difficult to say that the horror stories ever had a basis in actuality, because it was always somebody else and not the landlord that you were talking to that was giving that picture. The broader picture, the landlord flight picture, I dealt with when I was speaking. Just while I'm here, I'd like to make a comment about the Berlin case, if I might, which Caitlin mentioned. And that was a case in which the German Constitutional Court ruled on the Berlin rent stabilization system. And the important thing about that was they did not find that the Berlin rent fixing system was unlawful in itself. What they found was that the Berlin local administration exceeded its jurisdiction in bringing in such a system, because that was a system which could only be brought in by the federal government, not the local government. So it's not correct to come away with the understanding that the system itself was ruled unlawful. There may be further developments on that, as Caitlin mentions, but that's as I understand it at present.
Thanks, David. And to prove your point, even I've had a Rent Act case, so it didn't go anywhere fast. Caitlin, can you come in, please?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say the scenario of landlords fleeing the market and selling off homes does not fill me with fear, as it does some, because ultimately we do need a smaller PRS. I think, yeah, I think the person who asked the question is right. I mean, it's not something, it's difficult to imagine the affordability crisis getting actively worse. I think it is worth saying that, you know, increasing the supply of affordable housing is essential alongside rent controls, and that support for rent controls does not rule out and does not negate the fact that we do need to build more social housing and more housing of all kinds. But I think, you know, anyone who's spent any time campaigning on housing or working on housing cases or working with Londoners would know that the affordability pressures are so acute that we need something before that happens. Yeah, so I think it's valid. They're valid concerns, and we do need to address them. But I think the argument about landlord flight from the market, David has very succinctly rubbished there.
Thanks. Sem, did you want to come in on this?
I just agree with that. I'm somewhat relaxed about the idea that landlords would up sticks and sell, because if people are genuine about wanting a long-term investment, then they're just not going to do that. I suppose the concern I would have is that if we don't have a system which balances the needs of tenants against the requirements of landlords at a very basic level, has to be said, then the thing that will happen is that thousands of households, millions of Londoners will be made homeless if that landlord sells their property. So there is that genuine need to kind of stabilise things and then look at the affordability of those people in that sector. So a slightly different take on Caitlin, but agree in principle that I can't see it happening.
And there's one thing I'd add as well, is that we do have an opportunity with the upcoming Renters Reform Bill to change the rules on what happens if a landlord wishes to sell the house and what happens to a tenant as a result. And if the system that replaces Section 21 has stronger provisions in that, then that would also be something that would help in that case. Thanks.
The next question, I'm afraid, is a question from me, if nobody minds. We heard David's discussion of the history of the rent control legislation, and one of the striking things when you look at it, because it was reviewed several times during its lifetime, was that there was a very strong consensus in favour of rent controls for many years, even among landlords. Do you think we ought to try and focus on reminding landlords of the benefits of rent control, or is it a lost cause to try and bring landlords with us? Can I ask Sem first?
I was hoping you'd ask David, he's the specialist on that. I suppose there comes a point where if you can't, we have to try as political activists and as politicians to try and convince landlords of the benefits of the control to them. And for me personally, I think if we get to a point where we just can't convince them, and it's possible to have that amendment or that change in legislation, then I think it's the right thing to do. And I don't know how to make a legal argument about that, but it's just the right thing to do by millions of people in terms of living standards, kind of morally and financially. So it's not a very sophisticated answer, but I think that's where I would start.
Yeah, it's a very good answer. David?
Yes, well, that's a fair point you make, Nick, that there was a consensus for that period of time. When the question of rent control, and I agree that words matter, so that's why I talked about rent assessment or rent review when I was talking. When discussing with landlords that kind of system, we are talking, however much we or they might not like to hear it, of interfering with freedom of contract in the market. I remember my own landlord, when I was a Rent Act protected tenant, getting absolutely outraged at the reference to the rent officer, because after all, we had contractually agreed the rent. So there was me and my fellow tenants going back on what we had agreed. But I think it can be explained that there are advantages to the landlord. There's a stabilization of the housing market with fair rents or affordable in the way that we would use the term rents. Tenants are less likely to go into arrears, and landlords less likely to find themselves in issuing possession proceedings, which leads to expense and to gaps between lettings. And I think the other thing to add to this is that with controlled rents, it should be possible for tenants to obtain housing benefit more easily. Indeed, the housing benefit reform is a whole another issue which we could spend another webinar on. But if we could match rents to housing benefit, then that would remove any necessity to threaten court or go to court from a great many cases, I would guess.
Thanks. Caitlin, do you mind if I ask you the next question? One of the questions that's come in has made the point that rent controls don't do anything about the shortage of homes. And it seems to me that there's been a changing debate recently about the nature of the housing crisis. And I was wondering what the panel thought about whether there is a genuine shortage of homes, or is the problem more to do with affordability than with the number of dwellings in existence? And I wonder what Generation Rent thought about this.
Yeah, so we don't think they're mutually exclusive. I mean, most evidence does quite clearly show that there's a shortage of homes. We're not building as many, so there's a net loss of social housing every year, but also building homes at a rate that's slower than demand. I do accept people who point out that, you know, housing is not a simple case of supply and demand like other consumer markets, because, you know, everyone needs a home, unlike many consumer goods, and there's many factors like the price of land, planning regulations, etc. I don't think rent control and building more homes are mutually exclusive. I know that might be a bit of a compromise answer, but I think how we see it, you know, at Generation Rent is that you need, at the moment, renters across the country, but particularly in London, particularly in cities, urgently need to see interventions to reduce their housing costs. Long term, building more homes will do that to an extent. That does not mean that in the short term caps are unnecessary. And, you know, increasing supply, if and when it does happen, is not clear yet where that's going to be. There's still going to be areas of local pressure, even if at a macro level building more homes obviously will benefit renters. So I think you need both. Sorry if that's a bit of a non-committal argument, but I don't think that they should be done in isolation. I think you should do both: build some more homes and control rents in areas of local pressure.
Thanks. No, that's great. Can I hear from Sem? And then there's one more question, but I think Sem might need to slip away after this one.
Yeah, that's okay. Sorry about that. So I think the purpose of the control is to, well, do what it says on the tin, very one seal. And I suppose the one thing I would reflect on is that the overwhelming majority of people who are homeless, that we have a duty to house, they're all living somewhere. They just can't afford where they are living. And so I would, you know, obviously leave it to people like Caitlin and David to figure out how that would work in between tenancies, all that sort of stuff. But fundamentally, we have a shortage of affordable housing because people are being made to leave the place that they have put down roots and live in to go off to a place which is less suitable, but is within their price range. So I think we as housing campaigners maybe need to be clearer that what is the purpose of the intervention and what is the outcome, and not kind of come back to that point about being continued bogged down in identifying the issues and the knock-on effects. I think if we want to rent control, there are ways to do it. There are mechanisms to make that happen. And the issue about a supply is something which is slightly different. One example that's been given to me recently is that if you were able to, you know, we have lots of homes which aren't affordable to families, but they are family homes. They're being used as house shares because that's how people can afford them. If there was a mechanism to develop new homes, you know, controversially or arguably not necessarily all social homes, but homes which are 1 and 2 bedroom homes that people in the house share could move out of and could afford, were controlled, then you would free up the housing for those families. That's not to say that either the house sharers or the families shouldn't be able to have a home which is the right size and meets their needs, but I just think that one thing doesn't preclude the other. And we just need to think about where people are and where they would like to be. I think there's nothing wrong with wanting to meet people's aspirations, and the affordability of those larger homes which are being used because someone can afford smaller ones or the small ones don't exist is a really big problem. And I think the two things are interlinked, but one doesn't, mean the other can't happen. And we have to start somewhere.
Yeah. Sem, thanks so much for joining us and for your contributions, and good luck with everything you're doing at City Hall. I'm going to ask the other two panelists one last question, but thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Sem.
The last question is any form of rent control, certainly in England, will need national legislation, which realistically we're not going to have for the next at least few years. What should the Labour Party be doing now while it's powerless to change national law? What should we be doing for the next 2, 3, 4 years? Can I ask Caitlin first, please?
That's a good question. I think what the Labour Party can do, what some of the mayors are already doing, is raising the profile of the issue. And I think there's a lot of work to do to make rent control to build the case for it, make rent control seem like a very normal and fair and reasonable intervention. And I think that sort of work doesn't happen overnight. And I think there's a lot of speaking to tenants, speaking to landlords, speaking to homeowners, and making the case for rent control or for other affordability measures. So I think it's more, there's a real, I think campaigning and raising the profile of the issue before national legislation, before there's a Labour government. I also think, I'll stop there. I'm not sure,
Thanks. David, last word to you.
Well, it's obviously quite right that we won't achieve a rent control system without national legislation. So I think the first thing to do is to continue the process which we've already started, and this webinar is part of that process of working out a policy for rent control, rent assessment, whatever term we use, and the system which we want to see in the legislation. I made a proposal this evening, and we've heard about other systems in other parts of the world. So that's a debate which we need to continue with and to produce a firm proposal when the opportunity arises for legislation. The second thing is we also need a comprehensive housing policy, and for this webinar in particular, legal policy, which will take into account the whole area of repeal of Section 21, the new protected tenancies that should arise from that reform of housing benefit system, as I mentioned earlier, and provision for the increase of public housing, which will in itself have an effect on rents in the private sector. But I'm afraid it is hard graft work until we reach that position.
Yeah, it's going to be a long few years. Well, thank you so much to our panelists, to Sem, Caitlin, and to David, and thanks very much to Joe for doing the tech. It's been a really interesting discussion. We're running these webinars roughly once a month, so please do keep an eye on your email. And thanks very much for coming tonight and for all your intelligent questions, and enjoy your evening. Thanks very much.